Hello, and welcome to today's Policy Roundtable, A World Remade, the Geostrategic and Human Costs of the Ukraine War. My name is Karen Johnston, and I'm the Research Director and Senior Fellow at WIIS Global. WIIS is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality by helping women advance as leaders in the international peace and security sector. Our network spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents and includes 15,000 members who are committed to closing the gender gap worldwide. I want to recognize and thank our co-partners for this virtual roundtable event, WIIS Germany, and a special thanks to WIIS Germany's president, Dr. Amgard von Reden, and WIIS member, Dr. Maybrit Stumbaum, for working closely with us to make this event possible. We have 2 excellent speakers who will guide us through the complex set of issues surrounding the war in Ukraine and the state of play at this point in the conflict. Dr. Victoria Vdovychenko, an associate professor and researcher at the Borys Grinchenko Kyiv University. Her research has focused on the European Union and Euro-Atlantic integration, hybrid warfare, Ukraine foreign and security policy, and strategic communications. She is also one of Ukraine's key experts on Italy's foreign policy in Ukraine. We are particularly pleased that we were able to have Dr. Vdovychenko as a speaker. In April, WIIS sponsored a similar discussion on Ukraine with the Black Sea Women in Nuclear Network so they could share their experiences working in the nuclear safety and security field, especially their Ukrainian members who described listening to the roar of Russian cruise missiles flying over their nuclear power facility. It is important to give women a voice in this conflict, and we are grateful that Dr. Vdovychenko can join us. And we are joined also by Dr. Liana Fix, a historian and political scientist who is the program director for international affairs at the Körber-Stiftung's Berlin office and a former resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund office in Washington. Dr. Fix focuses on German foreign policy, European security, Russian foreign policy, and Eastern Europe. I look forward to hearing from our speakers about this timely and critical topic and look forward to a lively and informative discussion with our participants in Washington, Germany, and beyond. The ripple effects of Russia's war in Ukraine are changing the world around us. A worsening economic and energy crises all over the world, the instrumentalization of nuclear weapons by Russia, a potentially profound realignment of the international security order, the worst refugee crisis in numbers not seen since World War II, and the real threat of massive food insecurity and hunger across the globe. And the war is inflicting harm on vulnerable groups and women, and we know that the most marginalized and vulnerable are often the first to suffer. And we know that during times of conflict and economic breakdown, levels of gender-based violence increase. Women have been disproportionately affected by the crisis, and the situation has exacerbated pre-existing gender inequalities and discrimination. These are some of the issues that frame our discussion today. Let me turn to Dr. Vdovychenko first. Dr. Vdovychenko's expertise touches on some of the most urgent questions the transatlantic alliance and Ukraine are facing. Given that at some point there will have to be some cessation of hostilities, what does the future look like for Ukraine? What kind of European security architecture will there be? Where is the path forward for Ukraine? And what roles do gender and women's activism play in supporting that change? Thank you, Dr. Vdovychenko. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, Europe. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnston and colleagues. My pleasure, Dr. Fix, to be with you on the panel. Of course, thank you for the organizers, Women in International Security, for bringing us all together today and making it happen for us. And of course, talking about my country and to tell the truth, Karin, when you were telling the introductory remarks, I was thinking to what extent we should think about this European security architecture. And to start with, I should maybe back us to the rationale where we are. So what is the current status quo of these reflections that you were just putting? Because Russian Federation is one of, for us, I think, recent reminders of that breaking the rule of law can provide various benefits. Territorial benefits, financial benefits, cyber benefits, and of course political benefits, when we're thinking. So we see that the world of gaming, when the player is strong enough, it can do much what he or she wants, So we are thinking, to what extent does the rule of law count anymore? We see that there are many kind of fluctuations in the responses from the EU side, or even from the Western world side. Look at the aggression that was happening back to the 90s, starting with the Transnistria, then in 2008 within Georgia, no sanctions in 2008, then back again 2014 in my country, and now to the full-scale aggression. We see that there are much more of the hybrid threats that basically Russia's Federation support of the political activism to destabilize the free society. It's something that is happening. And of course, this gambling on threatening of the nuclear war, it's something like what we call psychological also warfare happening. And we see that many of European Union countries are making themselves thinking what's going to be next, especially during the winter, when and to what extent the resilience of the EU is undermined or not. We see that basically within the recent developments happening in the Black Sea, specifically, there is a very much existential threat to landlocking of Ukraine. So it means cutting, from Kharkiv through Donbas, Melitopol, Mariupol, then through Kherson, Mykolaiv, and then Odessa to basically to the Transnistria. And in such sense, there is still a challenge and there is such a threat that near the EU is going to be one more block or chain of the grain zone being formulated and being formed. And there is, of course, we have to talk about the information hybrid warfare, and because the Russian propaganda is something that is prevailing in the majority of our society. And there are much more of the challenges that we can think about happening in each and every our society, not only in Europe, but also within the United States in particular. But at the same time, we can think what might be also the solutions, how we see as Ukrainians. And that's, I think, my most important message to you, especially after yesterday actually was the final day of Lugana Recovery Conference. Just for those who do not know, Ukraine presented its plan of reconstruction and development and recovery in Switzerland. It should have been one of the reforming conference when it was planned in 2021, but due to the full-scale aggression, it just happened that the Prime Minister and the organizers changed the perspective of how the conference should look like. So you could hear in many of your news and mass media that there were the plans of how to reconstruct, recover Ukraine, and basically what we think also as Ukrainians to this extent. You heard about different plans of how to do that. You heard about the governmental steps on the focus on economic and investment policies, and of course in the involving the investment interest, because economy and investment interest is the key to any kind of the solutions when we're thinking about that. Taking into account Ukrainian story, business is doing quite hard. Some of them are physically, some of them are lost, some of them are waiting for some kind of the support. There are many of the businesses who put on hold some of their business operations, where they are thinking how to return into the production activities, and some of them actually being back to Ukraine after the period of being out. As you know, there are 8 million of people who are both externally and internally displaced. Internally and externally, 6 million of people, specifically on the majority of the countries who welcomed Ukrainian in mostly cases women and with children, was Poland, Romania, but not only, Germany, less Belgium, where I'm actually currently residing, also being a scholar at risk, some of the Baltic states, and to be precisely one of the next challenge for our government, but also to our society, is to think how to return these people back. From perspective, being myself an associate professor, we never put aside our education process. It's hard to believe, but it's one of the solutions of Ukraine's resilience. We've been prepared for that, taking into account that the war is happening in our country already for 8 years. So it means that being attacked, having the cyber attacks or being kind of the attacks, and then the COVID prepared us to be online or distance learning. So we do everything which is possible in order to return our students back, but the major problem here lies how to guarantee security for them. And it's one of the points that the Minister of Education and Science is raising that within the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, and it's still really hard. So when we talked about the businesses, which is the primary source of, let's say, income, the Ukrainian GDP fell, but not as dramatically in March when it was 50%. Now in June, it's about 35%. According to the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, it's more than 30% of Ukrainian companies stopped their production. So it means we lost about 60% of our GDP because the majority of these companies were doing that. And the losses, the major losses are gonna come till the end of this year. According to the data of the government of Ukraine, during the first quarter of 2022, our state as Ukraine, we lost already 15% of the GDP, and basically up to 50% of the GDP is going to be something on the estimates happening in of the losses, economic losses of not doing what we are looking for. We are looking for the biggest taxpayers to be returned. So the returning of the steel, metallurgy, agro businesses. We expect the second point I would like to raise, because Karen, you mentioned about the food security and actually insecurity in the sense. So this week was pivotal. I think you heard about the meeting of President Zelensky with the World Food Program, and of course the Turkey was kind of trying to make a sponsorship and negotiations happening. The point about the food security is that what to do with the next harvest. And let me explain here what's the position. Colleagues, be sure that due to the very good harvest that we have in 2021, our stocks are full of grain. But the problem, as you know, lies in the disruption of logistics, and that's what the Russian troops are trying to do. They try to disrupt as many and block the ports, not only on Odessa and Kherson. You know, there are kind of the provocations happening in the Black Sea, so therefore the Black Sea security is something to prevail. Ukraine, as you know, feeds 400 million people, a part of its own 40 million, and mostly of these countries are so-called low-income countries, but not only. The majority of the European Union countries are also receiving the Ukrainian grain. But if Ukrainian ports and railways that were linked before are disrupted and everything is blocked, so we are not providing you something that we are responsible for. The capacity of what we are doing now, we are thinking in terms, the government of Ukraine is actually thinking within the parliament of Ukraine how to expand the quantity of the transit of grain through Constanța, which is in Romania port. But as you know, the quantity logistically to do that in Constanța is less than normally Ukraine was exporting. And another way, what was the solution is about through basically the railway through Poland and then some of the Baltic states. But the differences in the railway systems of the connections do not prevail us to do that so quickly. You know that Ukraine also covers in global consumption not only 10% of wheat, which you definitely know, but 15% of corn and 47% of sunflower oil, which is something I think important specifically to the African continent when we think about on that. But we say that for a moment we have another problem, which is a challenge for us, that our ecosystem turned due to the Russian troop activities 32 million hectares of highly fertile Ukrainian land into basically something which is very much mined. So we are looking forward to the solutions of demining, and many of your governments to whom countries you are representing are helping now Ukraine in providing the effective demining, which started in particular within the Kyiv region, but will continue moving forward to some of the south regions as well. To tell the truth, when we were thinking about the capacity of how to be resilient, we were very much prepared also in a societal and economic and a military domain. But in the military domain, I think you know that Ukrainian soldiers received the trainings starting from 2014, and one of the training hubs was presented in Lviv region, which is in the western part, being bombed, trying to be bombed several times by the missiles, which never stopped even yesterday. It means that Ukrainian armed forces are very much prepared to the challenges of how to defend the country. However, the losses on the both sides are heavily, and Ukrainian losses are also heavily as such. So, of course, the emotional outbreak, and of course something that is a lesson learned for us, how to provide in the future psychological support to the people who are back or to the people who are staying outside. The majority of them again are the women and the children, and the mentioned problem of the violence and let's say related to the violence crimes on that, it's something to collect for us, and thanks to some of the investigations groups who are working on the territory of Ukraine now, we are trying to collect all of the major evidences in order to document the war crimes that were happening in the Kyiv region. The one I think that you've seen many of your times in the media within the Bucha and Irpin, but not only, we still don't know the evidences coming from Mariupol and Melitopol, which is the southern eastern part of Ukraine. As you know, the Russian troops are trying to basically destabilize the situation there in order not to make it sure that the investigations group can document the crimes and make sure that in the future there are any kind of, let's say, rule of law prevailing as such. Last but not least, of course, when we talk about the European security architecture and what we would like to see it in a nutshell, and we do believe that the future global security system, and European being as one of them, must be effective and equitable, and its effectiveness must be measured by its ability to prevent the wars, and if they occur, to stop them by the active and decisive actions. And you know, many of your governments turn to thinking to what extent they are resilient, because many of you admire how strategic communications are working effectively, and our president, one of the examples of effective communicating outside of Ukraine what was happening. But it's not sufficient now, because we have to make sure that the population is receiving what it wants, and the majority of the things is to receive is not only a prosperous future for the children, but the safety and security, which is so important just right now. When thinking about this future global security system, and what was the question from the organizers today, is of course understanding to what extent we are prevailing the rule of law as such. So maybe it should be the automatic exclusion of the state that is an aggressor from all of the international organizations or not. Maybe to think about what kind of economic unions it is inside and excluded it. Maybe it's about the freezing of the assets on the territory of the other states. And I know that the European Union in particular, and some of the countries you are from, they are thinking about such schemes. And of course, thinking about the world unity as something not in the future, but something now. What we need in order to counter all of the threats that the Russian Federation posed to us, in particular within the information domain where it's prevailing, and you could hear a lot still information from the Russian backed up channels which are operating somehow in Europe, is making itself doubtful for the Western societies. To what extent should they help Ukraine? And my question is, it's not about helping Ukraine only. My message here is that Ukraine is not anymore excluded from the future security of such a system. Because in the globalized world where economically, politically, security, we are all interconnected, we cannot exclude one partner from the majority of the system of another partners. So each and every morning, of course, normally all of us are thinking about now the vacations. So Ukrainian people are not thinking about the vacation. They are thinking more about who is alive and calling to their relatives and children, whether to make sure that even if coming back to Kyiv or other cities, we know what we are looking for. We are looking for restoring the peace and, of course, making sure that we are continuing what we were dreams about, because we would like still to continue dreaming. We think that the war crimes should be documented and, of course, presenting that those victims of war who became the victims of war, they know that the aggressor is being punished on that. We would like to make sure that the lessons learned from the resilience of what Ukraine is demonstrating is something that we can share, and that it becomes in the basement of the system of the international security as such. And we would like to rethink again that the word unity, it's not something very mystic or very neutral. It should be unity with understanding the principles of the rule of law in the international law that recognizes us as equal. We should think that economically we are very much in the partnership, and we have a lot to share, not only in the IT sector, but also in the production lines. We should think when rebuilding Ukraine, it's not because of Ukraine's investments. It's only about providing and making sure that we are living in the common, very much integrated, societally resistant world. Catherine, I'll stop for a moment here. Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. My apologies. Thank you very, very much. I was so pleased that Dr. Liana Fix of WIIS Germany was able to join us. She's written a series of essays in foreign affairs, written with her co-author, Dr. Michael Kimmage. The titles of her essays are all we actually need in terms of introduction, since they encapsulate all of the core questions observers, policymakers, military planners, and everyone else is asking. What if Russia loses? What if the war in Ukraine doesn't end? What if Russia makes a deal? And what if the Ukraine wins? Perhaps I should start first by asking Dr. Fix to give us an insider peek at what the next essay title will be. Surely the next strategic question that needs answering. Anyway, I give the floor to you, Liana.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you, Victoria, for these thought-provoking words from your side. We are actually working on the sixth article, which will be another scenario that could happen. But I have to say that so far, all our scenarios, even the good ones, have been on the relatively pessimistic side, which perhaps is, the child of the times we are in, and perhaps then it's better to rather have caution and to on the side of caution. But what I would like to do is to speak a little bit, into more details about these scenarios, how this war can end and how it can develop. And I'd be delighted to hear what you think, Victoria, are the most likely outcomes. And I would like to make 3 points. The first point is how our own thinking of the war and the consequences of the war has developed since February 24, because I think it's an important intellectual exercise to actually realize where have we been when the war broke out, when Russia brutally attacked Ukraine, and where are we now? The second one is, my second point is I would like to outline the from my perspective, most desirable scenario, which is, however, still one with quite significant challenges. So there's no happy ending in any of these scenarios. And the third point that I would like to make is to describe the scenario where I think we are currently right now in, and hopefully will not stay forever, which is a scenario which is called, what if the war in Ukraine doesn't end? Whereas the scenario that I hope will become true is the scenario, what if Ukraine wins? So about my first point, how has our own thinking about this war developed? And I'm speaking not only for myself, but to some extent also for my co-author, Professor Michael Kimmich, because we felt the need before the outbreak of the war, before Russia's attack on Ukraine, to really provide a wake-up call and to provide some thinking. If this really takes place, how will the world look like if Russia is able to occupy Ukraine? And so our first piece, it was published about a week before the outbreak of the war, was what if Russia wins? And it tried to, paint a really dark picture of a world where the EU and NATO are moving closer together under the umbrella of aggression, where Ukraine is occupied by Russia and used as a theater, as a threat theater for the rest of Europe, because it is not only about Ukraine, it is about the entire European security order, including NATO countries. And it was a pretty dark scenario, which I realized at some point managed to wake up some those who have read the scenarios or readers to the fact that the war in Ukraine is not only limited to Ukraine. I mean, as terrible as it is, this will have global repercussions, and this will upend the whole world, the whole European order after 1999. And from this point on, then, I mean, tragically, it actually became true. February 24 happened. And from that point on, our own thinking, and I like to think that to some extent it also represents Western thinking, developed. So we published further pieces. You quoted some of those, Karen, which were what if Russia loses? What if it's not able to achieve its main aims? And I think this was very much under the impression after the first weeks, and you know it much better, Victoria, where Ukraine's incredible resistance and resilience surprised everyone. Where just by the pure force of moral clarity and strategic necessity and belief in Ukraine's ability to win, actually managed to fight back against Russia's attack. The next point after what if Russia loses, what if it's not able to capture Kiev, to achieve regime change in Kiev, was what if Russia strikes a deal? And that was obviously the time before the atrocities in Bucha were discovered and in Irpin, where there were still ongoing negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, which after Bucha and Irpin and after Ukraine has become more successful militarily, were not on the table anymore. And we can discuss perhaps at a later point at which point it is actually useful or might be useful to get back into negotiations. I don't believe the point is now, but perhaps at some point it will be useful. And then obviously we had the chance to think about more positive scenarios. One of those scenarios was what if Ukraine actually wins? And that leads me to my second point, what is the desirable scenario? And I think on the sort of first glance, it's very easy. Everyone wants that Ukraine wins. I think there's really no one who doesn't share this hope that Ukraine wins not only for itself, but that it wins to show that exactly what you described at the beginning, Victoria, the rule of law still persists. But this piece that we've published has outlined quite some challenges. And I think these still hold true, because there is perhaps to some extent, some war optimism that we just have to fight Russia back, and then everything, will be fine. Russia will accept its mistake. It will sort of withdraw. It will ideally lose its imperialist approach in foreign policy and can start to become a normal country. And although this is certainly desirable, we try to outline that this will not be the case. And even if Ukraine wins, we have to think now about the day after, about the day after Ukraine's victory, what Ukraine will need in this case, because Russia is not going to accept defeat. They are not going to accept being pushed back even to the February 24 lines. So it might well be the case that Ukraine will actually need even more support, militarily, weapon deliveries, financial support, after it was able to push Russia back, because Russia will not let it be. It will try to regather its forces to attack Ukraine at the earliest opportunity again. So it will not be over if Ukraine manages to push Russia back, and even any kind of negotiated agreement that might be achieved from a position of strength will not be an agreement Russia will feel obliged to comply with, because it has become a strategic and historical necessity for the Russian president to make this place in history this way, and he will not move away from this goal. So the warning was, what if Ukraine wins? We might actually have to, this will not mean the end of our support for Ukraine, but this will mean a continuous struggle and conflict with Russia. And now the last point, and that's probably my last point, what is actually the scenario that we are right now in, the status quo scenario. I can send the link in the chat, so it's a little bit easier to follow the overview of all the different questions we have asked ourselves, which are 5 by now. But I think the status quo scenario, what we are in at the moment, is what if the war doesn't end? And I think that's the one which is most concerning, because the longer the war continues, the more we feel the global repercussions of this war. And by that, I do not only mean Russia using hunger and using grain exports as a means to basically take the entire world hostage, especially the global south, and at the same time to sell to the global south that it's about Western sanctions that prevent this, or that are the reasons for this food crisis. But it's also about the energy repercussions, about the repercussions, the inflation in Western countries. And that's perhaps a point, I mean, sitting here in Berlin in front of the Brandenburg Gate in our office, following the discussions here in Berlin and in Europe, that is a point, the closer we get to the autumn and to the winter, which I am at the moment most concerned with, that the war sort of moves into the background the longer it continues, and the issues of costs, of energy costs, of inflation costs become so dominant in the Western public discourse that the war itself and Russia's strategic aims in this war are not perceived as relevant as it has been before. And the calls for preliminary ceasefire about, you must have heard this quite often, Victoria, oh, why can't the Donbass go to Russia? And then we all have peace and quiet, that these immature and not thought through demands will become more prominent and will gain the upper hand. I wish and I hope we will move on to the what if Ukraine wins scenario. And I think the important precondition for this is that we do not allow the war to drag on forever, which means, and unfortunately this is the case, that Ukraine will need even more military support, because the aim to push back Russia will only be achieved if the weapon deliveries are calibrated towards this aim and not sort of sent to Ukraine in a piecemeal approach, as this is the case right now. And the same goes for sanctions policy. So I think we will need even more efforts under more difficult conditions. And that's why I hope we can, we can look optimistic into the autumn and into the winter, but I'm afraid we might be faced with even greater challenges than before. And I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Liana. And we have an enormous palette of issues and questions. I think that everybody, that are in everyone's minds. But I think one of the things that you, Victoria, have been working on is this strategic communications. And I think I have sort of two dimensions to this. Can you give, for example, a more representative picture of how women are working as agents of change inside this? For example, with this disinformation, because I've read that Russian disinformation campaigns have argued that NATO membership will require acceptance of Western gender relations and decline of traditional values. And is gender being used as a disinformation weapon? And my other curiosity, because we brought this up, is just how you feel about the Russian dissemination in Western Europe and, for example, in Belgium, where you are. I mean, are they being effective in the type of argumentation that you hear them presenting in the West?
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you very much, Liana, to your comments. I would have to say that we are on the same line of thinking to some extent, like what the scenarios you were presenting, but of course we are into much more the positive scenario, and that's why we are advocating to the positive scenario and explaining our partners that positive is not because we are wishful positive thinking. That's because we want to have a common future, and to have a place in this common future altogether, and for safety and security reasons. Coming back to your question, Karin, yes, Russia uses gender and classic so-called patriarchic values. It's very much obvious not in Ukraine, but in Hungary, for example. I think you heard about the place of putting on a specific position the Patriarch Kirill, right? And the argumentations of that is just, that's a religious leader, so we cannot sanction him. I said, oh, fantastic that this leader is promoting, terroristic acts, because it's blessing the death of Ukrainians. So, and it's not my words only. Come on, watch the YouTubes and how the Patriarch Kirill is actually baptizing the soldiers and asking to kill more Ukrainians. So it's nothing on my rhetoric only. So again, don't speculate and don't think my words on that. Don't take them for granted. Just Google it, as I call it to my students. And that's the official position of Hungary. And we know why Hungarians, for example, they accepted this candidacy status of Ukraine. There was always a preconditions that, as you know, one of the 7 points for Ukraine to do as a home assignment within the candidacy is to adopt the law on the national minority, which is the precondition is not about the minorities. The precondition is to about specific minority, meaning the Russian minority. And then it's going to be what Liana was putting us, Russia will never stop, because it understands the language of force. But it doesn't mean that the wording in the legal documents should be misinterpreted and twisted. So therefore, yes, gender is being used, but to be more precisely, it's been these values, like the religious values, being very much used as a misinformation message, to some extent. And coming back to your second question about how it's being used by the Belgian population, it's very interesting and challenging, and I must say there are different stories, because I'll be very simple and concrete. When you arrive to Brussels airport, the first thing you see is a big banner where it says, here it's Brussels, here's the headquarters of NATO and the EU, right? So it's something, again, don't believe my words, just check it. And I'm asking, and Belgium is the country that doesn't have bomb shelters. So I'm always asking my partners, okay, think strategically. You don't believe in the bomb shelters that Brussels or Belgium can be attacked. Think strategically. Where is the decision-making center of EU and NATO? In Brussels. So where do you know your way to the bomb shelter? No, because it doesn't exist in Belgium. It's one of also the policy of this country, not to have the bomb shelter. So very easy example for you to understand how sometimes the society doesn't understand. There are some people in the society that, okay, we will grant the humanitarian support, but that they don't come to our territory. There is still this difference of we are here and they are there. So let's keep them there. Colleagues, there is no here or there. It's just everything interchangeable and interdependent. Within the domain of the cyber, there is no kind of space like here or there. Within the economic domain, the same. within the political domain, sometimes, of course, you see a lot of the political games playing on the card, you know, of providing the electorate to some messages that the electorate wants, you know, and therefore Belgium is preparing for the elections in the upcoming 2 years, to be precisely. So therefore you could hear already in the discourse of this country, but not only of this country, many other countries. I'm just keeping this as an example of where I am residing as a scholar at risk. So this is very much being used. And the question that the Russian propaganda tries to sentimentalize, okay, the winter is coming, we need heating, we need to make sure that everyone is being safe and as business as usual before. And we are trying to raise awareness. It's not going to be as before. It's already, the world has changed, and we have already to be in this world and to adapt to this world. So in many cases, it's also the same message that some of the German politicians were raising awareness. Liana knows that much more than I do, and even within the government somehow, that the position is that, but it's again, to make the society doubtful about its importance of support to Ukraine. That's the message of the Russian propaganda, and it works somehow. And that's why in my speech, I was, I think, 2 or 3 times underlining the word unity. What do you mean by the word unity? Do you understand it that it's helping Ukraine because they are there? It's not. You are helping Ukraine because we are here all together, and we are facing this actually existential threat to our societies, where the key values are being undermined, when the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity is being undermined. What are there you should think about? And Russian propaganda, yes, use it as one of the very nice tricks to make you doubtful. And when it makes you doubtful, you are the target.
Yes, it's very, very important to think about the longer period, right, of adaptation and of commitment, and which is one thing I think that many people are concerned about, is how do you sustain the support, the financial support, the military support, economic support over that longer period, because it will be not just for this conflict, but for future of Ukraine, months, if not years. I'm interested in looking at both sort of where you, either of you and both of you, Liana and Victoria, sort of where you see, can Russia, how long is it, what is the probability of the impact of the sanctions, over the longer term going to hit and bite for Russia? Or do you see Russia finding ways of adapting, such as Iran has done with sanctions? And because of this longer period of adaptation and commitment, part of what's going to be important is to understand Ukraine's membership in the EU over the longer term. Now that the EU has granted Ukraine the status of EU candidate, again, how does this work in terms of this longer sense of commitment on the part of European elites and countries, for the United States, for everyone, in order for us to ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and the rule of law going forward? If either of you wish to, there's a lot packed in there, I'm afraid, but you want to try that, Liana?
Yes, I mean, I can try to tackle the first part of your question. So how can we sustain this? I do think the sanctions regime is here to stay. Sanctions, I mean, it's quite a comprehensive sanctions regime. And it's rare that sanctions are just in general rolled back for any reason. So I think the sanctions regime is something where economies quickly adapt and accept that certain actions are not possible anymore with Russia. So and it has also a normative and a moral value to uphold a sanctions regime, as it has been the case since 2014, is, for instance, for the European Union, a sign of its unity, a sign of its capability and activeness to do foreign policy. So it's not only about the sanctions, it's also about the actor who applies the sanctions regime. So a wall back there is quite unrealistic. And I do think the sanctions in the mid and long term, I mean, obviously they have an incredibly significant effect on Russia. I mean, in the short term right now, especially when it comes to energy, Russia is obviously benefiting because of the reduction of available fossil fuels, gas and oil. The prices are going up, so Russia is benefiting, and it can threaten Europe to cut supplies. But this was not something that Russia can sustain forever. So the economic damage, and I mean, all Russian economists are very pessimistic about the perspective of the country, although there were some initially some smart moves to protect the Russian economy. It's a very bleak outlook. But the other question, how long can we sustain military support for Ukraine, is a little bit more serious, because a realization in Western countries, both in the US and Europe, is also that we just don't have the industrial capacities to produce weapons on such a large scale as we need them right now. And not only to produce weapons for Ukraine, but also to sort of backfill our own capabilities. And that is something which will require a rethink of the entire industry. And there the point comes in, if we want Ukraine to win, we need to deliver weapons that are calibrated towards pushing Russia back to February 24 lines. We call this in one of our pieces the winning small scenario, because we do think that the winning big scenario, reconquering Crimea and the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that were occupied after 2014, will be much more difficult. So, I mean, even this winning small scenario would require weapon deliveries on a much larger scale than we have them right now. And I think there we will at some point come to the limits of our industrial capacities. And the third point, obviously, is we've seen in the Syria war how quickly Western societies forget what's going on. And I mean, we have seen the most brutal war crimes, including weapons of mass destruction in Syria. Obviously, Ukraine is a different issue. It's in our immediate neighborhood. It's a couple of hours flight from Berlin, which makes it, from the perspective of at least Central and Eastern Europeans, a much closer war. But one can get used to a lot. I mean, it's sad, but I think it's tragic, and that it's true, especially if the news doesn't really change, if it remains a war of attrition, so we will only have small changes in the front lines. And there, I think the ability to sustain solidarity and not to try to make shortcuts to quickly jump to a negotiated agreement without thinking through what will this mean in the future and does it serve our strategic interests, will be a very tempting solution for Europeans in crisis. But also, and I mean, that's another factor that we have to count in the US elections in 2024. I mean, to what extent will we have an irreliable or erratic US president again, who will not show the kind of leadership that we see right now from Washington? Because honestly, this is not about Europeans getting together and moving the ball forward. This is really about US leadership pushing Europeans to get their act together. So the US role here is much bigger than it was in 2014.
Thank you. Victoria?
Yeah, I will add to what Liana said, just some points that I think are important. Sanctions do work, but as we know, not in the short run perspective, but in the mid-run perspective. And that's something we can definitely make sure that, therefore, we are very much advocating for the sanctions policy. But sanctions also have a different effect. The one I think we should take into our audience. The idea why Ukraine is so much advocating for the sanctions is also, and I think this is my personal opinion, to make the Russian society think maybe the Russian leadership is doing something wrong, that it puts so much of the economic efforts and its income to liberating some territories. Maybe, so making the Russian society doubtful about its own leadership. It's going to be very hard to do, especially taking into account that Russian Federation is a police state, and within the information domain prevailing, and actually, let's say what we say, occupying the mindset and the minds and hearts of people, we still don't know how much of the percentage of support we have for the President Putin inside Russia, because the official sources are the official sources that are presenting you the information you want to hear, but we don't know that. And in this respect, that's going to be one of the, let's say, outcomes of sanctions policy. So that the Russian society will think, maybe it's not about liberating some territories from Nazis. Maybe they do not exist there. So it's very easy for me to say it, but it's very hard still in the process to do that in the moment, because it's in the long run. And of course, we also know that Russia also expects the elections, right? So it's something to take into account as well. And economically, the sanctions policy, again, maybe I'll repeat it, it works, but not in the short run. It works in the middle and in the long run. And making a privilege and understanding that somehow in the mindset and in the narrative of the Russian officials that Ukraine was a poor country doesn't work, because then there wouldn't be so much of the looting happening from Ukrainian's territory by the Russian troops and sending that to some of the regions. So to some extent, that's my main message. Because I'm, of course, we are thinking about our own society and our own security, and that's prevailing. To make sure that we are come back to understanding and advocating that Ukraine is no Russia. I mean, Russia is a different society, different culture, and Ukraine is something that we still don't have to do with this stereotyping of messaging imposing to some of the Western societies. Of course, you see how much and how strong the message can be when it's been supported by the whole nation. And in our case, we are such an example, but we are paying a huge amount of losses for that. Each and every day, there are soldiers, representatives of the territorial defense, volunteers, someone is dying. And we know that each and every day is a very costly thing for us. But at the same time, we'll never give up. And that's my next message for us to raise awareness here, because it's our existential threat. So it means what Liana was absolutely correct saying, Putin would like to rewrite the history of our country, where such a country as Ukraine doesn't exist, or where the nation of Ukrainians do not exist. If it happens, do you think that such an approach will not touch upon your societies? It's not. So it is an existential threat for us, but please raise awareness and understand that it might be also existential threat for your societies. Some of our neighbors were alarming, like in the Baltic states, in Poland. Now you know the reactions in Finland, in particular, also in Romania and Bulgaria, that they take it very seriously. So why not to take it seriously altogether?
I would be curious as to whether you think that you've both emphasized absolutely the right and existential right for Ukraine to choose its own future. It is choosing the West, and again, it has the possibility now to continue to advance in the EU candidacy. But my question is, you've underscored the need to embed Ukraine in the European security architecture, to give it that role, and for it to contribute to the broader future of European security. Do you think that the politicians and the leaders have turned that corner, have Will it be difficult for example, European Union to accept a country the size of Ukraine, right, in the future, or to have the possibility of, trying to understand how to rebuild Ukraine, the financial and economic commitment to rebuild the country? I see potential sort of waffling, and I wonder whether you think that commitment is going to be there when it needs to be there for Ukraine.
Maybe I can start here, and then, I don't know, maybe Liana, you will have some ideas more to jump into. First point, there is no European security architecture efficient without Ukraine being there. Second point, we are talking about now recovery plan and EU candidacy. The European membership or EU membership, it's a very long process. Theoretically, there are 15 steps for Ukraine to pass to become a member state of the EU. For those in the audience who don't know, the candidacy is only the 5th steps. So it means there are 10 more. There is very much a political will and political bargaining, because the European Union is it's not a union of 27 independent member states, and the decisions are to be taken by each and every individual member state within accepting the monitoring and evaluation commission that is coming actually at the end of October, beginning of November to Ukraine, as the one to see how the progress is going on or not accepting, to what extent, and so on. So I would put the stress on recovery of Ukraine. And Ukraine, yes, it's a big country and it's a big market, but it's also an opportunity market. So for many of your countries, because not only the products, but also the services that Ukraine was providing to many of the global markets in particular. And we would like to continue that. And therefore, the $850 billion that were that were announced by the Prime Minister Shmyhal in Lugano in the Ukraine's recovery conference is something like the estimates. But of course, the estimates should be including also the people returning home and the human estimates. So it means the human labor within the domain of with whom we should work. One of the questions that the universities are raising, what kind of students we're going to have on the 1st of September or in September when the new year is going to come. And to this respect, I would like to leave last minute on just the message before we jump to Liana. Ukrainians do not take their freedom for granted. They are fighting each and every day for that. Only together we can jointly think about our future, and economy is the key for that. Liana? Your mic, Liana?
Thanks so much. Still not used to it. Just 2 very quick thoughts before we wrap up. I think it was a big surprise that the European Union managed to give a candidate status to Ukraine. That's something that I didn't expect. I think it's a disappointment that the EU so far was not able to move further on candidate status for the Western Balkans, because this will put into question the legitimacy of the whole project. And this is a mistake that needs to be corrected. I mean, it's all about Bulgaria and North Macedonia and so on. It's a bit complicated, but this is something that has to be addressed. But the EU candidate status is a framework for political and economic cooperation, and it will be a framework for recovery, for Ukraine's recovery. It will give a framework to immense amounts of financial support to rebuild Ukraine. It is not a framework for any security guarantees towards Ukraine. This is not how this will take place. And even if at some point Ukraine will become an EU member, the article 42.7 of the EU is not an article that will actually lead to a security commitment towards Ukraine by EU member states. So for security issues, we need different frameworks. It will not be the NATO framework, because obviously this is by Russia perceived as unacceptable, but it needs to be a structure by the key states like the UK, the US, Germany, France, that commit to Ukraine security, provide security guarantees, which might be similar to Article 5 in the context of a negotiated solution. So EU accession is will not be from a EU perspective about security, it will be about political and economic cooperation. But, and to end on a positive note, I do think that if we are lucky, this is also for the EU the turning point where it understands itself much more as a geopolitical entity than in the past. And this is, the pressure was so strong on the EU to go the step for an EU candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova that it was able to move on these issues. And if that's the EU, how it positions itself as an entity after this war, then it's something to appreciate and to look forward to. But again, security is a NATO issue and will remain a NATO issue.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And we've run out of time. I would like to thank very much Dr. Liana Fix and Dr. Victoria Vdovychenko for their remarks. I think this has given us an insight into things as they are standing on the ground, but also to give us a lot of room for trying to understand what the, as you say, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term consequences, impact, and what the future can hold for Ukraine and for all of us. As you say, this is not a Ukrainian war. This is a broader global conflict where so many other countries are also impacted by this. And we hope that some of the scenarios that we've talked about will be the scenarios that we want to see, and we'll have to work hard to achieving those scenarios together. So thank you very, very much to WIIS Germany, vielen Dank, for your generous use of also your time and effort to put this together, and to our audience. And thank you again, and I hope that we will have more of these opportunities to talk to our Ukrainian colleagues and to other people who are concerned about these issues, just as we are. Thank you once again.
Thanks to you. Stay in touch. Bye.